Hi, welcome to this seminar about fighting a double war, the experiences of Black people during World War II. I'm Alana Quinney. I'm a history student, kind of studying modern history at Bangor University. Before we start, I kind of just want to give a bit of a trigger warning because we're going to be talking about racially sensitive content. That there will be racial slurs, racially offensive pictures. So if anyone wants to stop listening at any time, that obviously I don't want to make anyone feel uncomfortable. Okay, so fighting a double war, the experiences of Black people during World War II. So for this, we're going to be looking at the experiences of Black people both in America and the UK, looking at kind of during the war and that kind of period just like post-war, and kind of then looking at, well, whitewashing of history, why do we remember history the way we do, and how can we kind of overcome like our own prejudices. So kind of firstly, I just want you to take like 30 seconds or so just to think about what are the images that come to your head when you think of war, like World War One, two, just in general. It could be based on your own education, experiences, TV. Usually we kind of have this national memory that we kind of all have very similar images that we see in our head at the same time. Probably be soldiers going over the front line, that kind of Western front, tanks, guns, RAF, and then maybe the old white veteran that we see, well, usually see at this time of year, kind of outside houses selling poppies, that sort of thing. So it's kind of thinking, well, why these are what our national memories are? What about all the soldiers from the Commonwealth, Black soldiers across the world, but also that kind of well, the war wasn't just fought in Europe, it was fought in Africa, the Middle East, in the Pacific, and kind of think about all these aspects. Sorry, firstly, I kind of want to think about these two statements below. The first is a primary source. So adopt the double V for double victory from the Pittsburgh Courier in January 1942. And the second one, Black America's Double War, which is from Verna, an article written in 2015. So, what do you think these statements are saying? What are they referring to? Well, the double victory is the idea that Black Americans were fighting a war on two fronts, like in two arenas. So the physical arena of World War II abroad, but also back home, that fight for racial equality, because this is a period still in American history which is deeply racist, very separated in like segregation. And then so the phrase itself, it comes from James G. Thompson, who wrote the Pittsburgh Courier, which was the biggest Black American newspaper at the time, with about a readership of 200,000. And once they kind of adopted this slogan, then all the other newspapers and like Black newspapers in America did as well, and this kind of message spread. And obviously, it was very significant because Verna is still using this phrase in 2015. So looking at the experience of Black Americans at home, so there's this massive hypocrisy within America. This is at the time of President Roosevelt's speech. So in 1941, he gave a full freedom speech, which was looking at the freedom for speech, worship, want, and fear. Like that was his international war goals. And he said the way they could achieve this was by national unity and extreme patriotism. Their own country was massively divided on racial lines. So this is at the time of the Jim Crow laws, which were the legislation that legalized segregation. So like that picture at the bottom there with the coloured waiting room, they'd be separated for schools, cinemas, theatres. We think of Rosa Parks on the bus, the fact that she dissented and went to go sit at the front of the bus is a massive deal. So it's like, how could they be fighting for freedom abroad? Well, they didn't have their own freedoms at home. Yeah, FDR's speech also led to white nationalists actually saying that Black activism was massively disruptive to this wartime unity. And even the Communist Party, who were usually sympathetic to Black activism, were also saying that actually they're taking the spotlight away right now from what really mattered, which was war. And then that kind of created a dilemma for African Americans. Well, do you support your race, which that's your own equality for the rest of your life and your children? Or do you support the country and its fight for freedom? But it did work, and 1.5 million African Americans signed up to fight, with many Black women also supporting the troops on the home front. So this is where that double V comes in, especially for that Black activism. It's that gave African Americans the opportunity to fight both for freedom and for the physical war at the same time, like that justification. Okay, the experience of Black Americans at war. Well, Black Americans, unsurprisingly, still face racism abroad. So the things that white Americans were doing at home, they took with them. So they still face discrimination and segregation within the troops, you know, the slurs, stereotyping, sometimes physical violence, with even the recreation and transport facilities being separated. You know, only 10 American divisions that were sent into war were made of, or built up of, you know, people of different races. So that encourages, doesn't it, that separation. If you're never mixing, you're never learning about the other person. So it, it just exacerbates that difference. And also something I didn't really know until researching for this was that Black Americans also faced racism from white Americans on British soil. So there was the Battle of Bamber Bridge in Lancashire in the UK, which was in June 1943. And to kind of summarize the events, some Black American soldiers were drinking in a white bar, and some white military American police came in and were saying that they needed to be arrested because they weren't wearing their uniform correctly. It kind of escalated to the point where white British people kind of stood in and was like, well, actually, they're not doing anything wrong. What's the problem? And the white Americans went away in defense and came back with a machine gun car. So out of defense, the Black Americans went and got rifles, because they thought they were going to be killed, and that led to actual like a gunfight in the street, and 27 people were arrested. But the only people who were arrested were Black Americans because they were the ones who said to be starting it, to instigate it. And sadly, this is one of 44 American race-related incidents in Britain between November 1943 and February 1944. That's only a period of 4 months. What's happening either side of this? Okay, so I kind of just want you to take a sec to kind of look at this picture. What can you see in the picture? What does it say to you? The phrase at the bottom is kind of a mantra that was adopted by American officials at the top, saying that, well, there shouldn't be any heroes like Black heroes. So what we can see in the picture is a Black American soldier holding enemy soldiers at gunpoint. I mean, he looks particularly powerful because even though he's not even brandishing his weapon, he's still got these men at his mercy, basically. And why do you think that pictures like this would be kind of threatening to American social order? Well, they were seen as threatening. These pictures were not allowed to be circulated in America. It threatened that social order. Giving a Black person power over white men, even if these men were the enemy, kind of gave the wrong idea. It kind of created fear that Black people would take this notion of being more powerful than white people back home, and would kind of create that revolution. They would subvert the social order, create disruption, and that caused fear. So to kind of overcome this, American war photos had to present Black soldiers as more like helpers than fighters. They were there just to support the main action. One quote I found from an American lieutenant based in the UK was that, if you just read it for a sec. Particularly that they must be pretty ignorant. I can't see how. It's that inability, or that not wanting to understand a different society, being able to even comprehend how you could see Black and white people as equals. It's that so deeply entrenched within their system. And there was no integrated American army until 1948. So this separation that we saw with the divisions would have continued throughout the war. It didn't change that post-war period. But there were some effects of war. So African American soldiers based in kind of Western European countries experienced a society without that segregation, without that legalized racial line. And they were seen as liberators and Americans rather than just as Negroes, as they would have been seen back home. They wouldn't have been seen as Americans back home. That's that still dividing line. And again, that kind of gives them ideas of freedom. And if we look at the civil rights movement in the 1960s, these ideas about a non-segregated society, you can use examples that they'd seen 20 years previously in the war. But unfortunately, there was that post-war racial violence. So, for example, Reverend Hosea Williams had come back from war. He had won medals in the war, but he was beaten almost to death by a white mob in Georgia, because he had tried to drink out of a white-only fountain. And the very bleak reality was that some officers were lynched still in their uniforms and not just by white vigilantes, but also by local police, particularly in, the southern states. It's why did they still face segregation despite, facing the same horrors, the same experiences, the same battles? Is it because of the media hiding, their successes? It was seen as only a white victory, really, or is it because of that separation with the divisions? They never saw what the other side did. Okay, so now it's kind of moving to look at the UK. This is kind of from a different perspective because we didn't have that same racial dividing line of like segregation, like legally. But of course, you still have to remember that the UK in this time was still a racist society. There was still discrimination around. But to kind of look at this, we kind of need to look at more, why aren't the achievements of Black soldiers remembered? So this picture on the left is not a typical picture of World War II. So I kind of want you to look at this quote below. It's like, how far do you agree with this quote? It's about British history textbooks used in schools. Textbooks are Anglo-centric within a Eurocentric and Caucasian world picture. So, think about your own experiences, like whether you do, GCSE, A-level, or just from general knowledge of history. Is it that what you learn is based within an English point of view, within that your Western, especially European setting, and from that white perspective? This quote is taken from Stuart Foster, who worked at the Institute of Education at the University of London. And he argued that World War II textbooks, like British history, textbooks of GCSE, are like the worst perpetrators of that whitewashing, that kind of pushing aside the achievements of anyone other than the white soldier. And, it's why is this? Yeah, they only look at, the main 6 countries in World War II, that being Britain, America, USSR, then Germany, Italy, and Japan. What do you the effect of this? Do you think there is any kind of long-term effects of our own perceptions of the world and historical events? Because you kind of get a very narrow, one-sided view. It's not diverse. You miss out whole massive elements of, of the war that was going on. The British scene was different. There was no official racial discrimination. So this is a quote taken from Alan Wilmot. He was a Jamaican soldier who went over to Britain to fight in the RAF in 1944. And it's kind of, what do you take away from this? Like, I mean, officially, I'm drawn to the no official racial discrimination. That's kind of, he understands that, there was other like in other places, but also it shows that it was still happening, just lower levels, and it wasn't legally, it wasn't enforced, but it's still happening. Also, the British scene was different. It's kind of that world knowledge. He knows what's happening in America and how Black American soldiers are treated, and he can kind of place himself within that context. We need to remember that 600,000 African soldiers fought for Britain in World War II, and they had a very different experience to kind of white soldiers. So there are articles written about kind of called Britain's Black Forgotten Soldiers. And it's the idea that after the war, all these soldiers, so 600,000 just from Africa, had gone over to fight on behalf of Britain. And afterwards, the government had just forgotten about them, basically, just sent them back. And sort of, they were only paid a third of what their white counterparts of the same rank earned, even if they were from the same country, but, had lived in the settler colony rather than a native colony. They were still only paid a third. And this is similar to maybe you've heard of the Gurkha controversy, who were, again, only paid a third of what the British government had promised them. There were reports that African soldiers faced corporal punishment from officers, even though the practice of corporal punishment for petty crimes had been outlawed in the British Army from 1881. There are still accounts that, soldiers were beaten for kind of stepping out of line, for going above their rank. And also the promotion of Black soldiers was rare, which is again like American policies. It's the idea that you couldn't have a Black soldier in charge of white men, because again, that's just subverting that normal societal order. But there was also experienced stereotyping. Again, this was a quote taken from Wilmot that he had. Because you're Black, you don't need to wash. It's some stereotypes and that kind of like racism that's still underlying kind of every day. Difference from American soldiers. So then we kind of need to analyze the difference between the two. So how Black British soldiers were treated badly, kind of in comparison to African American soldiers. Well, Alan Wilmot said he was usually treated well by white civilians, And he puts this down to being that they understood what he had sacrificed for his country, you know, how far he'd come and putting his life on the line. But I would kind of already question, well, what does treated well in his respect mean? His treated well might be very different to what we would expect as, being treated well today. He probably may still experience racism, like casual racism on a day-to-day basis, but it's kind of ingrained, well, that's normal. That was how society was, and he kind of accepted that. Black British soldiers were also known to socialize with white women, like in dance halls, and some black soldiers even married white girls. But this would often cause conflict within the girl's family. She might be disowned for it. And it also caused anger amongst white soldiers because they couldn't understand why would a white girl choose a black soldier when they could have a white one, basically. There are accounts of black British soldiers having bad relations with white Americans. So kind of, again, that as we saw from that quote from the American lieutenant, that was that inability or just not wanting, again, to understand a non-segregated society. And it would kind of lead to fights, especially in like dance halls or recreational places where, there'd be different races mixing at the same time. And as we saw in like the Battle of Bamber Bridge, sometimes you got to the point where white people would have to step in or to kind of de-escalate it. There was also black British soldiers who were kind of able to protect black American soldiers who were based in the UK, because the white American soldiers didn't have any jurisdiction over them. So they could kind of hold it off until the police turned up and it could be sorted. But it isn't just black history that's been hidden. Britain was one of the biggest suppliers of soldiers in World War II, despite being such a small country. Because of the size of Britain's Commonwealth, still then informally known as its empire, they could provide soldiers from across the world. So India provided 2.5 million soldiers in World War II, all of which were volunteers, because it was that allegiance and that loyalty to the mother country, essentially. 8 million people fought from the Empire and Commonwealth in both World Wars, with 300,000 losing their lives. That's 1 in every 26. Millions were involved in the war effort to provide food, materials, equipment. And in the West Indies, thousands of volunteers from the Home Guard and British Army, volunteered. There was 5,500 men in the RAF. And even West Indian women could serve in the Women's Auxiliary Air Force and Territorial Service. I also just kind of want to quickly draw your attention to the poster on the side. This is a World War II poster. When you look at it, what are you kind of immediately drawn to? Well, it's them 5 figures at the front, isn't it? That Commonwealth poster, all under the British flag. That's Australia, South Africa, Canada. It's the white soldiers, the bigger ones who are at the front, who your attention is drawn to. And then kind of pushed to the back, a little bit smaller and out the way, and then very stereotypical images of, ethnic soldiers. Why they decided to depict them in that way? What's it showing? Well, the whole thing is like, well, you can be together, but the white soldiers are always kind of at the front. They can't give the ethnic ones too much, power at the same time. So Foster, the guy who we got the quote from at the beginning of the UK section, he did a textbook analysis of GCSE textbooks in 2005. He chose 4 GCSE textbooks, with the criteria being that they had to be published after 2001, and it had to be published by a major publishing company. And what he found was that all the textbooks, they all refer to British Army and troops, but they don't expand on what is that umbrella term for British Army? Where do they come from? Are they from the different Commonwealth countries? There was also that, none of the books dedicated more than a few sentences to the conflicts in North Africa and the Pacific. And the contributions, as I've kind of already picked up on, is that the experiences of soldiers from the Empire and Commonwealth, they're just overlooked. And this kind of, if you look at the thing above here, it's the photographic representations of Second World War. Well, all of them have between 10 and 31 pictures, but photographic representation of people of colour from the Empire and Commonwealth, they have none. There is not one. And again, it's that pushing to the side and kind of, pushing out the way. And Ferriby and McCabe, they only reference 6 countries in their book. So that 6 we mentioned at the beginning: UK, USA, USSR, Germany, Japan, Italy. But 60 countries fought in World War II. So they mention 1/10 of the full picture. I mean, how many of us can actually name the full 60? So this kind of all conforms to Sherwood and Spafford's kind of 1999 argument that British school history is almost always silent about the participation of Black people in World War II. And this kind of just supports that. So now we kind of look at, well, how do we overcome whitewashing? Whitewashing kind of being that, giving it a massive white perspective, the history is written by the white man for the white man. Well, Foster kind of, obviously moving on from the concluding from his analysis, was that our textbooks need to be more diverse. They need to reflect a sensitive picture of race and ethnicity and the relative roles and nationalities and communities that were actively engaged in the struggle against the Axis powers. So yeah, just making it more inclusive of everything, that, not just narrowing it down, having that narrow point of view. Moving on from this is, again, that education needs to be more reflective. So you might remember from the Black Lives Matter movements earlier this year, there was a lot of emphasis and also petitions about, well, changing the curriculum, re-looking at it, making sure the curriculum reflects our, our diverse society, making sure we learn about all the different aspects and make sure that everyone is learning about something that's important to them. And also re-education. So that's the idea of, when you hear someone being racist, you hear someone, making a whitewashing statement, you challenge them on it. You give them and you kind of show them about the different aspects that are involved in World War II. It wasn't just white soldiers. And this isn't just for this particular topic, that can be anything across the board. Rupert Gaze, who works at the Imperial War Museum North in Manchester, says that, we need to encourage Black history to be integrated in all our discussions and work, meaning basically that Black history shouldn't be seen as different from British or American history. It should just be, British history to be inclusive of all aspects of history. Okay, moving on from this, the Imperial War Museum North has a permanent exhibition called Mixing It, The Changing Faces of Wartime Britain, which was again designed to make sure that there was more knowledge that World War II wasn't just the white soldier, basically. And they also have resources, they teach classes, there are displays. Kind of, again, their aim is to make history more inclusive and more accessible for their communities. So just some thoughts to leave you with. Does control in the past promote certain national memories? And if so, what are the effects of this? Again, is there like a white agenda? Is it made by the white man for the white man? What can we do as a society to make British history more inclusive and diverse? Again, we kind of just touched on this in the past slide. And has this seminar changed your perception of the soldiers and the experiences of those who fought in World War II? And if you've taken away one thing that you've learned from today, I feel like I've done something good. If you have any kind of further reading, I'll just kind of move this out of the way a bit. That's just some further reading where I got some of this information from. Yeah, and thank you for listening.